Do you ever wonder why the House of Representatives only has 435 members instead of, say, 500 or 600? Well, the reason is like everything else in politics, a wild mix of history, power struggles, and good old-fashioned congressional gridlock. See, originally the House of Representatives kept growing with the population. The more people, the more representatives. But by 1910, they had hit a problem. The country was absolutely booming. The country's size grew to 92 million people. And at that point, Congress was like, all right, hold on here. So in 1929, they passed the Permanent Apportionment Act. This locked in 435 members forever. See, if you added more members, power would have shifted, and that just couldn't happen. Unfortunately, this has caused a lot of problems that we're still dealing with today. The reason is because the population keeps growing. See, every 10 years after the census, there's a reapportionment based on population. So that's why states like California lose seats, states like Florida and Texas gain seats because people are shifting around. But the House of Representatives was not made to be like the Senate. It was made to be a representative body. And the more people you have in a district, the less representative it becomes. See, in 1790, each representative spoke for about 34,000 people. Today, they're speaking for over 760,000 people. Unless you're in a small state like Wyoming with just one congressional district, then it's less. So congratulations, Wyoming. Your vote counts extra. Let's talk about why so many people in this country, especially younger generations, can't afford a place to live. To do that, I want to briefly start in the 1950s. In the 1950s, Americans fell in love with suburbs. After World War II, so many were using their GI Bill to buy suburban real estate. The government poured billions into highways, and developers built sprawling neighborhoods of single-family homes. It was the American dream, a house, a yard, and a white picket fence. But the catch was that these suburbs were built on cheap land, far from city centers, and they were almost exclusively for white families, thanks to racist policies like redlining. Fast forward to today, those sprawling suburbs have eaten up a lot of cheap land, and now we're running out of space to build, especially in cities where people want to live. And instead of building affordable housing, or at least market rate housing, developers are often cramming in luxury condos. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, because that's where the profit is. But the second reason is probably bigger, and that's NIMBYism. These people that own these single-family residences don't want those people near them. And now we've also got the situation with Wall Street and investors buying up homes. Now, even as recent as a couple years ago, I didn't think that this was that big of a problem because only about 2% of housing stock was being purchased by investors. But it really started taking off starting in 2021. In 2021, 1 out of every 7 homes sold went to an investor. Overall, though, this is largely a supply problem. So I'm fine with these luxury condos as long as they're also building the other stuff. And now let's talk about wages. The average rent in the US is well over $2,000 a month, but the average worker only makes $27 an hour. That's an average of 60% of your paycheck going to rent, and that used to be closer to 30%. So as a result, you need to save for decades just to afford a down payment. And finally, political will. This has only really just recently become a national issue, or at least a national issue that people are willing to talk about. Now, this just scratches the surface. The crisis is much deeper than this. But these are the major reasons. You've got decades and decades of bad policy decisions. Now we've got 800,000 plus people on the streets. Young people can't afford the American dream, and it's probably the main source of our hurt right now, at least financially. Everyone deserves a place they can call home. If it's not already apparent, the President of the United States has way more power than our founding fathers ever intended. And it didn't just happen by accident. And I'm not just talking about the election. Congress and the Supreme Court have spent 200 years handing more and more power to the executive branch. When our Constitution was written, our founders were obviously very afraid of a king. And this is why Article 1 of the Constitution talks about Congress, not the president, because they're most important. Constitutionally, Congress controls war, taxes, laws, trade, and spending. The president's job was simply to enforce. Now, our first 3 presidents were great in this regard: Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. Jefferson was even worried that the Louisiana Purchase was unconstitutional. But the superiority of Congress did not last. Congress is supposed to declare war, but only 5 of our wars have been fought with a formal declaration. Over the years, this power shifted more and more firmly in the hands of the executive. Now, this power really started ballooning with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964. This allowed LBJ to fight a war in Vietnam without a formal declaration. And then we have the War Powers Resolution of 1973. This said that the president only had to notify Congress 48 hours after he already took action, and that he doesn't have to withdraw forces for 60 days without a declaration. This is pushed far enough, but almost every president since then has completely ignored this. And then we have the 2001 authorization for use of military force. This gave President Bush unlimited authority to fight terrorism all over the world. And every single president since has used this to their advantage. And then we've got economic power. Again, constitutionally, Congress controls the power of the purse. But in 1934, Congress gave FDR the power to control the value of the dollar. And then in 1974, Congress let Nixon take us off the gold standard. You could argue one way or another on this, but the fact is this shifted economic control to the executive and the Federal Reserve. And then you've got all of these executive orders. During the Civil War, Lincoln famously suspended habeas corpus without Congress. Again, I want to be clear, I'm not arguing good or bad one way or another. I'm talking about shifting power. FDR signed almost 4,000 executive orders, including the internment of Japanese Americans. And we're going to come back to that in a second too. And then we've got something that I'm afraid Trump is going to use a lot, and that's the National Emergencies Act of 1976. Since then, presidents have declared 75 national emergencies. The most recent examples are Trump trying to use this to fund his border wall and Biden with his student loan relief. The truth is, though, that Congress can vote to stop it, but they never do. And now we get to what you would think would be the final backstop, the Supreme Court. But they seem to love expanding presidential power. In the U.S. versus Curtis Wright in 1936, the court said that the president had inherent foreign policy powers beyond what was in the Constitution. And then we've got Korematsu versus U.S. in 1944. This is what upheld FDR's Japanese internment. And then in Chevron versus NRDC in 1984, the court gave the president broad powers to interpret laws and implement regulations. And now we're seeing a court that'll basically let the president do anything and claim they're under his job duties. By the time the late 20th century rolls around, historians were calling the American presidency an imperial presidency. Presidents now control drone strikes, sanctions, tariffs, immigration rules, all with little to no oversight. And now we have President Trump, and he's going to take advantage of all of this. But it doesn't have to be this way, and I think there's conservatives that think the same way. Congress can change this anytime they want, but they don't. And I think the biggest reason is politics. It's much easier to let the executive branch take the blame and hash out the details. And you just look good passing big, broad pieces of legislation. I just hope it's not too late. Let's talk about Christian nationalism and how, among other things, it's fueled government dysfunction. This isn't about religion itself. It's about a political ideology that's actively undermining democracy. It's created legislative gridlock and prevented real solutions to some of our biggest problems. Christian nationalism is the belief that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation and that its government should enforce conservative Christian values. It's not about personal faith. It's about using religion as a tool for power. And when this ideology takes over government, it leads to policies that reject pluralism, demonizes opponents, and disrupts how our institutions function. Christian nationalists claim that the founding fathers wanted a government based on biblical law, but this is just not true. What they did believe in was natural law, which is very different. Natural law is the idea that human rights and morality come from reason and universal principles, not religious doctrine, but those universal principles can come from God. So when you're talking about things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those things aren't from the Bible. They're from Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who argued that all people have inherent rights regardless of religion. Now, again, the principles of life and liberty can come from God, but these aren't biblical directives. These are just overarching principles. Our founders like Jefferson, Madison, and Adams were deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinkers. That's why they created a secular constitution that doesn't mention Christianity at all. And even in the Declaration of Independence, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson argued whether God should be included or not, which is very far from basing the thing on Christianity. In contrast, Christian nationalism argues that our rights come specifically from their interpretation of Christianity. That's why they push for laws that enforce religious beliefs, like banning abortion and anti-LGBT laws, and even push to make school prayer mandatory. This is a direct contradiction to what the founders said and really not from the Bible either. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. John Adams even signed the Treaty of Tripoli in 1797, which stated, quote, "The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." Today, Christian nationalism is unfortunately a dominant force in American politics. As of 2023, 10% of people fully embrace Christian nationalist belief and 19% are sympathetic. And those are also typically the ones that are most active. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Trump advisor Michael Flynn have explicitly called for making Christianity central to government. It's also eroding our secular institutions. The 2022 Dobbs decision was heavily influenced by conservative Christian beliefs. And because this is fundamentalist in nature, it makes compromise nearly impossible. Under the Biden administration, Republicans refused to even do military spending over things like LGBT rights, book bans, and DEI attacks, all driven by religious conservatives. Instead of helping Biden do things like build roads, they were arguing over what was in the Pledge of Allegiance. But Christian nationalism isn't just about policy, it's about power. And often, as we're seeing now, goes hand in hand with authoritarianism. The leaders pushing this ideology believe democracy should take a back seat to God's will, which conveniently aligns with their political goals. We saw this all play out on January 6th. It wasn't just about Trump, it was fueled by Christian nationalist rhetoric. Insurrectionists carried crosses and banners that said, "Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president," and even held prayer sessions in the Senate chamber. In fact, political scientist Samuel Perry says that Christian nationalist beliefs were the strongest predictor of support for the insurrection. It also plays a huge role in voter suppression. Many right-wing lawmakers justified voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and other restrictions by framing them as efforts to preserve Christian values. The Brennan Center for Justice found that states with strong Christian nationalist influence are far more likely to pass laws that restrict voting access because they want power concentrated in the hands of white conservative Christians. And now we're seeing the result of what happens when Christian nationalism goes unchecked. Historically, when religion and government merge, you get authoritarianism, you don't get democracy. If we want a functional government again, we have to protect the separation between church and state. The founders knew this and built our entire system of government around it. And now we need to confront it. If you want to study this further, I recommend a book called Jesus in John Wayne by Kristin Du Mez. It does a great job illustrating the reality of much of what I talked about here. The war on terror was ever only partially about keeping us safe. It was more about power, money, and control. The U.S. used it to justify war and surveillance, and authoritarian governments worldwide use it as an excuse to suppress entire populations. And now in 2025, Trump is bringing it all back. After 9/11, we were all told that we need to fight terror at all costs. And it was driven by a national anger that was like nothing I've ever felt before. And it led us to 2 decades of war. War that was never really justified. Iraq was based on a lie, no WMDs, but we still invaded. Even Afghanistan, a 20-year war, the moment we left, Taliban took back over. But defense contractors made billions. Oil companies seized profits, and the government expanded its power to spy on citizens through the Patriot Act. And to make it worse, we set the blueprint. Authoritarian regimes around the world copied us. They saw how easily fighting terrorism could be used as an excuse for crackdowns. China labeled the Uyghurs as terrorists, opening the door to mass surveillance, forced labor, and concentration camps. Russia used it to justify their brutal war in Chechnya, and later on its crackdowns of protests and independent media. India also expanded its anti-terror laws and used them to jail journalists and silence Muslim activists. Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia all did the same thing. The message was clear. If the U.S. could justify human rights abuses, then so could everybody else. All of this has destabilized the entire world and made huge power vacuums. But of course, all wasn't just abroad. The Patriot Act let the government spy on Americans. It was used against activists and regular people. Police militarization also skyrocketed. The gear and tactics used in Iraq and Afghanistan ended up on American streets. Drone warfare also expanded everywhere. The U.S. normalized assassinating people without trial. And now all of this has led us to this present moment. The war on terror fueled nationalism, and fear and led to Trump's rise. Islamophobia became mainstream, and so Trump exploited this by banning Muslims. Surveillance powers never went away, and so now Trump is using them against his enemies, even journalists. And endless wars never stopped, and it'll in fact probably get worse. Trump is already using some of this rhetoric for places like Greenland and Canada and Mexico. See, the war on terror was about justifying authoritarianism, even though that's the complete opposite of the principles that this country was founded on. Freedom is not always peaceful, but it's better than being a slave.